Welcome to Lecture 1 of the Strategic Peace Building. In this short lecture, we're going to cover a basic understanding about violence and conflict, look at peace building as a comprehensive approach, an integrated approach, some of the principles, and look and begin to see how peace building is multidimensional. To start with, we're going to look at some ways in which we understand conflict and violence and peace. We're going to use Johann Galtung's models of conflict, violence and peace. And there are three basic models, triangles, that Galtung has introduced. The first one, which is a triangle of contradiction, attitude and behaviour, is Galtung's way of looking at conflict, in that there is always a contradiction. The behaviour indicates something about the way we react to the conflict, and attitudes in terms of whether or not it leads to polarisation, to us and them ideas. So it's about the actual conflict itself. Then, of course, conflict and violence are two very different things. Violence is one of the ways in which you can react to conflict. So if we're looking at dealing with violence, there's the direct violence, the stuff that we see in terms of people being killed or tortured around us. But there's these two under the surface types of violence, the structural violence, the kind of systems that mean that many people live in poverty, that many people are disenfranchised, that some are thought of to be less than the other. So things like racism, sexism, patriarchy would fall under the system of structural violence, not allowing people to be who they are and freedom. And then maybe sort of underpinning all of it is this idea of cultural violence, that the way in which our societies are set up lead us more often to believe that violence is a solution. So the idea that we honour people who have fought in wars and not so much those who have brought peace, in terms of videos, films, media, the way the media focus on violence and not peace stories, the way we talk about things, the way that children are allowed to play and the values that they're given, and the way that museums, particularly we can see in the UK and around the world actually, the museums we have are all about war museums, armament museums, and there are hardly any peace museums. So it's a way of culture. So understanding the three sort of types of violence. If we then look at peace building, peacemaking, peacekeeping, this structure initially proposed by Galtung and obviously been adopted widely since then, has the idea that there are these three components, that there's actually around peacemaking, the way we negotiate and resolve conflicts. There's peacekeeping, where we actually stop the direct violence, and peace building, which is this more overarching idea, the way in which we change societies and systems, tackling structural and cultural violence in some ways in order to build a long-term sustainable peace. It's important to remember when we're thinking about peace and conflict that conflict in itself is not a problem. Conflict, in fact, we would not want a society where everybody was the same, believed the same thing and never had any disagreements. What we need to look at in terms of peace building and the way we deal with individuals is that it's the violence we want to reduce and not the conflict. So, and in some ways, what you might want to look at is the way in which local people might want to escalate a conflict if their needs are being ignored and suppressed, and that's stopping them being able to achieve a peace, then actually enabling them in part to escalate the conflict in a non-violent way can be part of what we do. So we're not always trying to stop conflict, we're trying to prevent violence. And that's really important, I think, when we think about what local people do. We're not talking in this module about the big systemic issues, about the way international organisations work. talking very much about what happens on the ground, and people on the ground will have disagreements, and the way in which we learn to handle them would be quite important. As part of that, these 4 dimensions of conflict and conflict transformation comes from the reflective peacebuilding reading of Jean-Paul Lederac. And in this, he gives us this structure in way of thinking about how conflict changes things. So there is this very personal level, the way in which we deal with conflict, the way in which we deal with anger issues, about how we react, our own behaviour, our own emotions in relation to conflict. So there's that sort of level and how we change people there. There's the relational level where people work face to face, where we were looking at villages, communities, groups here, and the way they communicate with each other, the way they view each other. Is it very us and them, or is there some understanding that humanity as a group, we want to be considering how conflict can be creative and positive and transformative and not lead us into a destination to violence. And then again we come into structural and cultural. So the way in which conflict works at a structural level, how everything is organised, how relationships work, about power issues, and about what all those different, looking at more interrelated groups. So we're moving beyond that personal, relational, very local issue into more of a sort of structural, regional, maybe national level. And then again, these sort of like deep-seated cultural issues, which of course can cross many boundaries. If we're looking at conflicts between nations, it may be that those nations have very different cultural levels of cultural understanding. The conflicts are there, and if we're looking at changes, it's about how do we change the norms in any particular culture that support the use of violence in order to resolve conflicts. The kind of norms where maybe men are brought up to believe that using violence is part of their initiation into society, where women are told that they should not intervene and not participate. So a lot of cultural change and part of conflict. So this Lederac gives us this example. So at this point it might be interesting to think about, in terms of conflict, about different levels of conflict you've experienced or you know about, whether you have conflict in work, whether conflict has created something more constructive, new ideas, new influences, and also when you can see bigger conflicts which are maybe sort of like analysed on a national level, about the different levels. Is there a cultural level of analysis? Is there a structural level of analysis? How is it that we see people relating to each other? And are there even sort of like personal aspects, the way that people are maybe traumatised, which is influencing and affecting the way in which they deal with conflict? So using that. When we come on to thinking about the peacemaking, peacekeeping and peace building model of Galton, what we need to remember is, although it was set up very much as a structure and sometimes portrayed as a structure of peacemaking being something which is a high-level mediation or negotiation, that peacekeeping is military peacekeepers in a UN DPKO institution coming, or a big funded maybe electoral process of peace building. And what we have to think of is that is one aspect to it. But as we'll look at in the next lecture about the way Lederac has proposed, and it's now been sort of much more widely adopted, this idea that actually people must be involved. And what we're going to examine over this module is the way in which local people, local voices, local actors are involved in all three levels of those. They can be involved in peacemaking in terms of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms, in terms of having community structures, community awareness, community mobilisation, in order to examine conflicts and ways in which they're resolved, security issues, and communication with other levels of actors within the conflict. Within peacekeeping, whilst UN military peacekeepers coming in tend to remain very much within a military structure, there are also many NGOs who provide unarmed civilian peacekeeping, where civilians provide protection and support, very much on security levels, very much about reducing violence, but at local community level actors. And then again, peace building, which is very broad, and we'll look at in more detail the work of Tanya Paffenholz as she explores the different sort of like dialogue, training, capacity building aspects of using the resources of people who already know how to, they understand their conflict, and a way in which we can support them to have a vision for the future, a long-term sustainable vision for peace in the future. So, within all this, trying to see it as a move away from a very top-down level of peace building and conflict transformation to an idea that the strategic level of strategic peace building, where it's very integrated, a much more holistic view, and an understanding that the linear process of we de-escalate something, disarm, the state building and reconstruction, where we see that conflict escalates and de-escalates, move away from that, examine the complexity on the ground. We try to understand reasons for the slow progress of change. So what we want to see is looking for as many options for intervention, for using local resources as possible, but that key point of building in integration, coordination, cooperation, communication between those actors. So not only getting people in villages to talk to each other, but also if we can escalate that up to how they relate to higher levels of civil society, religious leaders, schools, education, and what link there is. And often this is the hardest part, is to link that up to that top level of where government are working. This is so. What we really need to understand is sort of what is this this view of strategic peace building that we're trying to see. This is a view from the Kroc Institute in the United States, whereby they see very much as like these are the different paths that feed into strategic building, but it's by no means comprehensive. So we have got just in the centre, we've got justice and healing, we've got violence prevention, and we've got structural and institutional change and leading out. So within justice and healing, there is restorative justice, transitional justice, trauma healing, all essential components if we're really going to build long-term sustainable peace. But under violence protection, there's the whole humanitarian. And we know that there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done on conflict sensitivity and do no harm. There's the government and multi-level efforts. So there is the sort of like the more top-down. There's a non-violent social change. How do we restore power to those who have been disenfranchised, marginalised and polarised out of systems? So what can we draw on from the non-violence theory? Then there's sort of dialogue and mediation strategies at a local level as well as an international level. And then when we look at structural and institutional change, there's education, the development work, dealing with transitional and other global level of threats, around law and advocacy work. So you can see there's beginning to bring a lot in, but within this we don't have sort of disarmament work either. And reintegration work, although some of that might come within trauma healing. or reconciliation work, which is often seen as a necessary component. A different way of looking at the areas of work is you could look at this in terms of, if you start by building capacity, there is training work, there's conversion, there's research work. Then there's again waging conflict non-violently, the idea of non-violent social change, including here about advocacy, against civilian-based defence or civilian-based peacekeeping. And if we're going to reduce that direct violence, we've got peacekeeping, we've got ceasefire agreements, we've got peace zones, early warning programmes. So obviously early warning and early response is now a key component, but it's like we really need to have that on the ground, and there are good examples from around the world where people are trying to have an early response component to early warning. And again, it's a key part, if we look at any of conflict transformation, reconciliation work, it's that transforming relationships work. So whether it's trauma healing and allowing people to trust again, whether it's restorative justice, trying to understand the truth, and rebuild relationships, and whether it's built into the governance and policy making work of that change. So it's looking at a much broader view, and I'm sure you can already see where people that you know and situations that you've studied, how local people would fit into these, as well as sometimes needing external support and expertise. This one about timeframes is important because Jean-Paul Lederac, who we'll study much more in the next slide, really tries to help us understand that this is a very long-term process, and the very short, immediate work we do of dealing with one issue, of dealing on a crisis level, maybe there's been a lot of an increase in direct violence somewhere, that really needs to be seen as a crisis management work. And if you look on the bottom axis, it's saying the time frame as that gets longer and longer. Then if we move into a future where we're still dealing with that one issue, but maybe we can prevent an escalation of violence. And then if we move upwards, you can see we're moving along that one issue to understanding the relationships, the subsystem within which that one issue is present. So then we're starting to look at the transformation. And if you look up to the whole system about where all this violence emerged from, we can see that there are root causes, which we can start addressing relatively early on. But if we're going to achieve long-term transformative change, it's about dealing with it at that big systemic view, as well as at the local issue, and it's about a long-term time frame. Jean-Paul Lederac now says he's not willing to work on a project which is less than 10 years in its vision, and we're really talking about imagining generational change. So it's not that finding local capacities for peace or national capacities for peace is in any way a quick fix, a way of us solving any problems. It's a necessary component if we're going to achieve long-term, sustainable, transformative change and peace. And that we must involve them, but in no way thinking that that's going to be a quick, short solution.